Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy reaches its most emotionally demanding point when it confronts anguish. Not anxiety in the clinical sense, not fear of danger, and not despair in the everyday meaning of hopelessness. Anguish, for Sartre, is the lived recognition of freedom without guarantees. It is the moment when responsibility becomes inescapable and no authority remains to absorb it. To understand anguish, one must first understand why Sartre believes it is unavoidable. If existence precedes essence, then human beings are not born with a nature that dictates what they must become. They are not guided by divine commands, fixed values, or moral laws written into the fabric of reality. They exist first and define themselves through action afterward. This absence of predetermined meaning does not produce neutrality. It produces pressure. Every action becomes a declaration. Every choice affirms a vision of what a human being ought to be. And because there is no external authority to certify that vision as correct, the individual must bear the weight of judgment alone. Anguish arises precisely here. Sartre insists that anguish is not fear of consequences. One can fear punishment, failure, or pain without experiencing anguish. Anguish emerges when one recognizes that no matter what one does, one is responsible for choosing it. Even if the outcome is uncertain, even if the situation is constrained, the act remains one's own. This recognition destabilizes ordinary moral comfort. People often believe that moral certainty comes from rules, traditions, or roles. Sartre denies that any of these can remove responsibility. They may guide action, but they cannot choose in one's place. To follow a rule is still to decide to follow it. Anguish is therefore the emotional register of freedom. It is how freedom feels when it is not disguised by excuses. Sartre goes so far as to suggest that the absence of anguish is suspicious. When people feel entirely at ease with their choices, he suspects that they are hiding behind a script or denying responsibility. This claim reverses common assumptions. In everyday life, anguish is treated as a problem to be solved, medicated, or avoided. Sartre treats it as evidence that one has understood the situation correctly. Anguish is not a malfunction. It is clarity. To illustrate this, Sartre gives simple examples. A military commander who knows that his decision may cost lives experiences anguish not because he is weak, but because he understands the weight of his choice. A parent deciding the future of a child experiences anguish not because they are confused, but because they recognize that no rule can guarantee the right outcome. In both cases, anguish arises from responsibility without appeal. There is no formula that will make the decision correct in advance. One must choose and then live with having chosen. This leads Sartre to a more radical claim. Anguish does not disappear with experience or authority. Even leaders, experts, and moral exemplars cannot escape it honestly. Authority may expand one's power, but it also expands responsibility. The more one's actions affect others, the greater the weight one carries. Sartre rejects the idea that expertise dissolves anguish. Knowing more does not eliminate responsibility. It intensifies it. To understand the consequences of one's actions more clearly is to feel their weight more fully. This is why Sartre believes modern attempts to eliminate anguish are morally dangerous. Psychological explanations, social norms, and ideological certainty all promise relief. They tell individuals that their actions are determined, expected, or justified. In doing so, they transform freedom into comfort. Sartre does not deny the appeal of this transformation. He understands why people want to escape anguish. What he denies is that this escape is honest. To remove anguish is to remove responsibility, and to remove responsibility is to remove the seriousness of action. Anguish, therefore, plays a crucial role in Sartre's ethics. It prevents moral automation. It forces the individual to confront the fact that they are acting without guarantees. It blocks the fantasy that one can be innocent by following rules. This does not mean Sartre celebrates suffering. Anguish is not a virtue to be cultivated for its own sake. It is a consequence of freedom that must be endured rather than eliminated. Sartre does not promise that life will feel better once one accepts anguish. He promises only that it will be honest. At this point, Sartre introduces a second term that deepens the pressure: abandonment. Abandonment names the condition of existing without God, without a moral lawgiver, and without a pre-established hierarchy of values. Human beings are abandoned in the sense that no one has provided them with instructions. This abandonment is not tragic in a sentimental sense. It is structural. There is no authority to consult that can tell one what must be done. Even if one believes in values, one must choose them. Even if one believes in rules, one must decide to follow them. Abandonment, therefore, removes moral shelter. One cannot say, "I am doing what is commanded," without acknowledging that one has chosen to obey that command. Sartre insists that responsibility cannot be transferred upward. Anguish follows naturally from abandonment. If no one has laid down values in advance, then one must choose them without certainty. One cannot wait for permission. One cannot defer indefinitely. Action is unavoidable. This is why Sartre rejects the idea that morality can be grounded in obedience. Obedience may simplify life, but it does not absolve. One remains responsible for choosing obedience over refusal. By the end of this analysis, anguish appears not as a psychological disturbance, but as a philosophical signal. It marks the point at which freedom, responsibility, and abandonment intersect. It is what human existence feels like when illusions are stripped away. Sartre does not offer consolation at this stage. He does not explain how to live happily under these conditions. He explains why comfort itself often rests on evasion. The pressure continues to build. Because if human beings are abandoned and condemned to freedom, then the question becomes unavoidable. How do they live at all under this weight? And what happens when hope itself becomes an excuse? That is where Sartre's concept of despair enters. If anguish reveals the weight of freedom and abandonment names the absence of moral shelter, then despair marks the final stripping away of illusion. Despair, for Jean-Paul Sartre, is not emotional collapse or pessimism. It is the refusal to rely on anything that lies outside one's control. It is the discipline of acting without hope as an excuse. Sartre uses the word despair in a deliberately counterintuitive way. In everyday language, despair suggests paralysis, resignation, or loss of meaning. Sartre rejects this interpretation. Despair, for him, is clarity. It is the recognition that one must act without appeal to guarantees, progress, or hidden forces that will rescue one's intentions. To despair, in Sartre's sense, is to confine oneself to what depends on one's own action. It is to stop expecting the world, history, or human nature to cooperate. One acts knowing that outcomes may contradict intentions, that efforts may fail, and that no moral accounting system will reconcile the difference. This position collides sharply with moral optimism. Many ethical systems encourage hope as a virtue. They promise that good intentions will eventually be rewarded, that justice will prevail, or that history bends toward improvement. Sartre regards these beliefs with suspicion. Hope, when it replaces responsibility, becomes another refuge from anguish. Sartre does not deny that people hope. He denies that hope should guide action. To act because one expects success is to condition responsibility on outcome. Sartre insists that responsibility must precede results. One must act because one has chosen to act, not because one believes the action will succeed. This is why Sartre insists that despair is not nihilism. Nihilism denies value altogether. Sartre does not deny value. He insists that value is created through commitment. Despair simply removes the illusion that value is guaranteed by anything beyond action itself. Despair, therefore, sharpens responsibility rather than dissolving it. One cannot say, "This will all work out," or "History will judge kindly." One acts knowing that nothing ensures vindication. This knowledge intensifies seriousness. Sartre illustrates this with the example of political action. One may fight injustice without believing that justice will triumph. One may resist oppression without believing that resistance will succeed. To condition action on hope is, for Sartre, to excuse inaction when hope fades. Despair refuses this condition. It demands action without reassurance. This refusal is deeply uncomfortable. It removes emotional incentives that people rely on to sustain effort. Sartre accepts this discomfort. He believes that moral action loses its integrity when it depends on emotional reward. Despair also dismantles the appeal to human nature. People often justify behavior by claiming that humans are inherently selfish, violent, or weak. Sartre rejects this move. There is no fixed human nature that determines outcomes. To appeal to it is to excuse oneself in advance. By rejecting appeals to nature, history, and hope, despair isolates the individual with their choice. One acts without expecting confirmation from the world. Responsibility becomes internal rather than external. This isolation does not mean solitude. Sartre does not advocate withdrawal. He insists that action still occurs in relation to others. What despair removes is the fantasy that others will act in predictable or supportive ways. This realism extends to moral judgment. Sartre does not promise that responsible action will be recognized or praised. One may be misunderstood, condemned, or forgotten. Despair requires acceptance of this possibility without retreat. At this point, Sartre's philosophy appears almost inhuman in its demands. He asks individuals to act without comfort, hope, or assurance. He strips away nearly every emotional incentive that sustains moral life. Sartre's justification for this severity is simple. He believes that acting under illusion is worse than acting without consolation. Illusions eventually collapse, and when they do, responsibility collapses with them. Despair preserves responsibility by refusing illusion from the start. This does not mean Sartre denies joy, solidarity, or meaning. It means he refuses to ground them in guarantees. Meaning arises from commitment, not from expectation. Solidarity arises from shared action, not from promised success. Anguish, abandonment, and despair therefore form a single structure. Anguish reveals freedom. Abandonment removes moral shelter. Despair removes false hope. Together, they define the condition under which Sartre believes authentic action becomes possible. This authenticity is not serenity. It is lucidity. One sees the world without guarantees and acts anyway. By the end of this triad, Sartre has removed nearly every psychological and metaphysical support people rely on to justify their actions. What remains is not emptiness, but exposure. The individual stands alone with their freedom, responsibility, and commitment. This exposure does not end Sartre's philosophy. It prepares the ground for its next confrontation. Because once individuals accept freedom without illusions, they immediately collide with others who are doing the same. Freedom meets freedom. Responsibility meets responsibility. Conflict becomes unavoidable. That collision between self and other is where Sartre's analysis turns next.